Hello, I'm Deborah Goggin with the Department of Research Support at A.T. Still University. In this presentation, I will explain how to create tables for the results section of a journal article. So what is the purpose of a table in the results section of a journal article? A table should be used to report the numerical data outcomes of your study. Tables are better to use than figures when you need to report large data sets or exact numerical outcomes. When creating tables for your journal article, read your target journal's instructions to make sure your tables meet their requirements. In general, most medical science journals recommend using the table function of Word to create tables. Because most of these journals follow the current edition of the American Medical Association Manual of Style, the table suggestions included in this presentation follow these guidelines. To create a table in Word, choose the Insert tab and then click on the drop-down option for Tables. Choose Insert Table from the drop-down list, and you will see a pop-up box to insert table. The Word default setting for tables is 5 columns and 2 rows, so be sure to adjust those numbers for the number of columns and rows you need for your table. If you need to add or delete rows or columns after you have already created your table, you can do that later by using the Insert or Delete Row and Column table functions of Word. There are several standard elements of a table. For example, every table needs a title. The top of every column should have a heading, including the leftmost column. The named study outcomes are placed in the leftmost column of the table and are referred to as the row headings. The standard convention is to use limited grid lines in the table and no shading of rows at submission to your target journal. The standard convention also includes no bolding of reported data and individual data cells. Let's look at a basic example table. It has a title. The leftmost column has the study variables. This column is generally formatted with left margin formatting. All columns that report numerical data are formatted to be centered. Although this table example doesn't have any acronyms, if any previously defined acronyms from the article text are used in a table, they have to be redefined for the table. Where you redefine those acronyms depends on where you use them in the table, but they are generally provided in an alphabetical abbreviations list below the table and outside table formatting. Let's look more closely at the specific elements of a table, starting with the table title. Importantly, the table title should never be included in the table formatting. The title should be written using normal text formatting, and then the actual table is inserted on the next line below the title. According to current conventions, a table has to be able to stand alone without reference to the article text. So the title needs to provide readers with enough context to understand the table. In general, the total N or number for the study population or experimental sample is provided in parentheses at the end of the title. Note, the table label, Table 1 in this example, is bolded. The actual title is in title capitalization and is not bolded. There should not be a period at the end of the title. As a reminder, this formatting of the table title follows American Medical Association guidelines. Some medical science journals have different instructions for formatting the table title, so remember to check the journal's instructions for correct formatting of your tables. The first row of your table, or the top of every column, whichever way you prefer to think of this, should have a heading, including the leftmost column. This top row is often referred to as the column heading row. The column heading of the leftmost column is generally formatted on the left margin, and the column headings of most other table columns are centered. The standard American Medical Association convention is to use bolding and title capitalization when providing the labels for the column heading row. This row generally identifies which broad category of study outcomes you are reporting and how you are reporting the numerical data. Make sure to include units of measure when necessary. Please note the NO period notation is used for frequency, or also known as number, in tables. Because the column heading label indicates that reported data in parentheses is a percentage, you don't have to include the percent symbol in individual data cells. If your table is longer than a page, the column heading row is typically repeated on the next page or pages. To make that formatting change in a table, select the entire column heading row, right-click on the selected text, and then choose Table Properties in the pop-up box. In the new pop-up box that appears, shown here, click on the Row tab and then check the box to repeat as a header row at the top of each page. Click OK to accept the change. By repeating the column heading row, you make it easier for readers to follow the information in your table from page to page. The leftmost column of the table is the row heading column. This column is for your study variables. Please note the standard American Medical Association convention is to use no bolding and sentence capitalization for the row heading text. However, in this example table, the variables in this column are capitalized because they are proper nouns. If one of your variables has subcategories, the convention is to indent those subcategories. In the example table, each variable has subcategories. By using this indentation, you help your readers visually group the content for each variable. You can indent subcategories in the row heading column by changing the left margin of the individual cell for each subcategory to 0.2-inch indentation. From the Home tab of Word, choose Paragraph and adjust the left indentation, as shown in this example. Now let's consider the data columns of a table. As previously stated, these columns are centered. Outcomes that are supposed to be reported together, such as frequency and percentage, or mean and standard deviation, should be included in the same column and individual data cells, as shown in the example table for frequency and percentage. Use a consistent number of decimals for all data. However, if you have a zero data outcome, the standard convention is to use no decimal places, as shown for the Native Hawaiian race category outcome. Importantly, you should never leave any data cell empty. If there is no data to report for that cell, the convention is to use NA for not applicable. Note, a zero outcome is considered data. Do not use a hyphen or leave a blank cell when you have no data. That type of notation is too ambiguous for readers. It can be hard for them to determine whether there was no data or you just forgot to add your data to that cell. When you create a table in Word, all grid lines are included in the table, as shown in this example. However, most journals do not want grid lines in submitted tables. When creating your table, though, it is often easier to leave the grid lines until you are finished adding the data, because the lines make it easier to see individual table cells. So how do you remove the table grid lines after you are finished creating your table? Use the Borders and Shading table function to remove grid lines from tables. You can access this function by choosing the Table Design tab in Word, clicking on Borders, and then choosing Borders and Shading at the bottom of the drop-down list. Or you can right-click anywhere in the table and then choose Table Properties in the pop-up. The Table Properties pop-up defaults to the Table tab, so you will need to click on Borders and Shading to access this function, as shown in the bottom image. In the Borders and Shading pop-up box, click on None to remove all grid lines from the table, and then click OK. If you right-clicked in the table to reach this function, instead of using the Table Design tab, you will also need to click OK in the Table Properties box after you click OK in the Borders and Shading box. Once all grid lines are removed from the table, highlight the column heading row at the top of the table to add horizontal grid lines above and below that row. Once the row is highlighted, right-click in the row, choose Table Properties and Borders and Shading, or use the Table Design tab to reach the Borders and Shading pop-up box. Change the width to 1.5 point, and then click on the top of the preview to add that line to the top of the row. Change the width to 1 point, and then click on the bottom of the preview to add that line to the bottom of the row. Then click OK. You will also need to click OK in the Table Properties pop-up box if you right-clicked in the table to reach this function. Next, highlight the last row of the table and follow the steps used for the column heading row. However, for the last row of the table, you will only add a line to the bottom as shown in the example image at the bottom of this slide. Make sure to change the width to 1.5 point for this last row of the table. Then click OK to accept this change. As shown in the example table, the grid lines should now be removed except for the column heading row and the last table row. In general, there should only be grid lines in these 2 rows of the table. This is the preferred format for most journals. If your table is long and complicated, though, it is sometimes necessary to add a horizontal grid line between individual study variables. To add grid lines between study variables, use the previously described steps for adding grid lines. However, when adding those lines inside a table, make sure your line width is 1 point. In this example, we will add horizontal grid lines before the race and ethnicity study variables. As shown in the image, the row for the race variable is being modified to have a horizontal line at the top of the row. In this example table, the grid lines have been added between the study variables. So how do you add another row to a table if you later realize you are missing data that you need to add? For example, what if you need to add a non-binary category for gender? In Word, click on the Table Layout tab. Place your cursor in the table where you want to add a new row, and then under Rows and Columns, choose Insert Row above or below. It depends whether you want the new row above or below the cursor location. This same method can be used to insert columns. You can also right-click in the cell where you want to add a new row, and then choose the Insert option in the pop-up box to add rows or columns. As shown in the example table, a new row and the missing data have been added. When adding a new row, it may be necessary to follow previously described steps to format the content in the row according to standard conventions, such as indentation for subcategories or centering in data cells. If you later decide that you need to delete a row or column from the table, you can also find that option in the Table Layout tab under Delete. Click on the drop-down box to choose your options. You can also access these options by right-clicking in the row or column you want to delete in the table, and then choosing the Delete Cells option in the pop-up box that appears. So what do you do if your column heading row is more complicated? As shown in the example table, one of the data outcomes, frequency and percentage, has subcategories. In this case, a grid line called a column spanner is used above the subcategories to show their relationship to the outcome. Two table rows are used to create this kind of column heading. The first row of the column heading will have the main headings for each column, and the second row will contain only the subcategories. Do not put the column headings for survey question or p-value in the second row. Please note, this example table also has some other common elements of tables. For example, this table has a table note about the data. Table notes should be placed below the table and outside table formatting. This table also uses the lowercase n notation in the row heading column of the table. This notation is used in tables when you have reported data for a specific variable that does not correspond with the total number n of the sample. However, if you have to use this notation in a table, it has to be used for every reported study variable. In some cases, like the first survey question, your lowercase n may be equal to the total n of 90. It is often easier to format this type of column heading when your table still has all the default grid lines. To make the column spanner, select the cells in the first column heading row above your subcategory responses. The gray shading indicates these cells have been highlighted. Once those cells are selected, go to the Table Layout tab in Word and choose Merge Cells. Make sure the new merged cell has center formatting and then add your NO% label. You can also access this option by selecting the cells you want to merge, right-clicking, and then choosing Merge Cells in the pop-up box that appears. Please be aware, however, that once you merge cells like this, it can be very difficult to add or delete new columns or rows in these sections of the table. As shown in the example table, the column spanner has been added to the column heading row. This example table also has some other common elements of tables. Please note that the significant p-value in this table has not been bolded to show it is significant. The standard convention is to report all numerical data in a table using normal text formatting. Similarly, the asterisk should not be used to indicate significance of an outcome. Instead, the preference according to American Medical Association guidelines is to use a specific p-value column in the table and to report the exact p-values for each variable. This concludes this Department of Research Support presentation about how to create tables for the results section of a journal article. We hope this information has been helpful. Are you an ATSU faculty researcher? Do you have a research project that you would like assistance with? The Department of Research Support can help. Our staff can assist with research coordination and project management, statistical analysis, and manuscript editing. You can find out more about our department through the provided URL.